Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar about demand forecasting with external signals, limited history and probabilistic thinking. I have Professor Yves Sagaert here with me. Hi Yves, welcome. So today's webinar will be slightly different, I would say, from the other webinars I've done in the past. This one will be a bit more educational, I would say, where Yves will be explaining some concepts, then we have a discussion. But like every webinar, we will have a Q&A still in the end. So don't worry if you already have some questions prepared. You can put those in the Q&A section as usually. I will monitor that. If they are relevant during the discussion itself for any of these three key points, I will actually cover them at that moment and already ask them to Yves as well. So don't hesitate to ask any questions. So to introduce ourselves very briefly, first I'd like to introduce Professor Yves Sagaert, who is a professor and also researcher in demand forecasting at KU Leuven and VIVES, which are in Belgium, and also at IÉSEG in France. So welcome, Yves, again. Thank you very much for being here. It will be very interesting for everyone to get to know your insights. From my side, I'm one of the co-founders of Horizon Solutions, a planning platform. So with that short introduction, let's get into it, into the first topic of today, which is about external signals in demand forecasting, something that I believe the more technical appropriate term would be leading indicators, if I'm not mistaken. But you can tell us and explain maybe a bit, what is that? How does that work?
Yes, thank you. So from my side as well, welcome everyone. Thanks for your interest and time. Hope it will be a concise and to the point session. And indeed, the main question, the question we like to start with is what is a leading indicator? Well, we defined leading indicators as an external variable that contains predictive information for our target variable, and that with a sufficient enough lead. So there are two things here. One is then it's an interesting relevant variable, so that has some kind of information. That's first. And the second part is that there is a sufficient lead, so that we can actually do something with it. We can make a forecast, and on that forecast we can also still make a decision, so that we can do something with that forecast. That's where the leading effect comes into place. So if we take, for example, the leading indicator on oil price, we can use this macroeconomic information. This is just an example, but we can use such macroeconomic information as a leading indicator in our demand forecasting, as a feature, if you wish. The key element here is that we use we model it correctly, so that we use the knowledge that is available up until today. It's a very relevant variable still in the current volatile business environment. But suppose we have this as a leading indicator, we start our modeling process, and at that moment in time, so now we are starting the modeling process, but suppose for our training, we go up until December 2025. So we are simulated in the environment December 2025. It's quite important that we then also only use data up until December 2025, so that we don't use the increase that has been seen in the recent months in our modeling process. Of course, in the rolling origin or in the upcoming months, once we use the model, we can use the updated data, but for the simulated data, we only use information up until that month. So to go a bit more technical, how does the leading indicator work, or how do you then model these elements? What you ideally want to start from is the blue line. So that is the historical sales. That's your own realized sales data. And what you want to parse on that is the red line. So the line in the middle, the line that sticks out a bit. That it would be our leading indicator. Now the leading indicator hasn't exactly the same shape as the sales, but we want to align it as much as possible so that it has approximately the same shape, according accounting for some other effects, of course. If we do that shift, we shift the leading indicator with the red arrow, and that red arrow, the first red arrow, is actually our leading effect of leading indicator. if we do that, this is the optimal from a modeling perspective, but we get the second red arrow for free. So that is our free information that we can use then to make a demand forecast. So in our modeling process, we will use the red line at the bottom, which is now our shifted leading indicator. We will optimally model our historical sales data to the leading indicator. We will use the leading indicator to forecast the green line. So for the green line, you can use to make a future demand forecast. We are in the green zone. What we cannot do, which I discussed in the previous slide, is make a forecast in the red zone, because there is no information available from that leading indicator that far into the future. You could use a forecast of the leading indicator, but there again, this might be prone to forecast errors, and especially in the current volatile environment that we are, it's often difficult to make such forecasts. So that's a complexity to have. One thing that we want to avoid is that we overfit on seasonal patterns, for example. This is information that we should tackle in advance or separate altogether. Together with events and promotions, this is actually cheap information because we know it is happening. We can get it from the data. We can get it from our own in-company data warehouse, in contrast to the external information. The leading indicators are typically external information that we need to do some effort for to obtain that type of data. So the information comes with a certain cost.
Thanks, Yves, for that introduction already. And to pick a bit further onto that last point on the external data, often companies find this interesting, want to explore this, but the practical side of it, how do they identify these right signals, or how do they obtain that external information that is of sufficient quality to make this analysis? What kind of sources are there?
So indeed, you need this type of external data. You need to obtain it. It comes with an effort. The easiest way to get started is to review open databases, such as an Eurostat or a FRED database. This information is freely available. It also might be less linked to your specific end sector or market. Next to that, you would have commercial data suppliers. That's often once you have tried the open data sources, you say like, oh, I want to have some more granularity. Then you can go to commercial databases. Sometimes some companies already look at those type of data sets. And then you have sector specific or very detailed data, which can serve as leading indicator for your modeling approach.
Mm-hmm. So typically this kind of information, except that maybe for Eurostat, does come at a cost for companies, right? So they have to check, is it worth it to investigate this? Will it be a good signal or not? Yes, okay. And from doing the analysis, because you have to look at that indicator, see if it's indeed a leading indicator, what kind of tools are used for that? And I don't want to go into too much technical details here in this session, because the audience is not pure data scientists per se, but what kind of tools and what kind of people with which skill sets can do this, in your opinion?
Yeah, so indeed, you cannot throw the entire database at it. You need to make somehow some kind of selection, and either you optimize this in a statistical way, so a data-driven way. So you find some machine learning algorithm that can do it for you. That's a more technical approach. Or the other approach is that you do it manually, that you have experienced demand planners or supply chain professionals who say like, look, these type of indicators, we have been tracking them for years. We know they are relevant. We just make the translation from leading indicator to our sales in a gut feeling way. And then you can optimize the modeling way. Of course, the most beneficial part would be in a combination of those two approaches, and then you can combine it with also the detection of the optimal leading effect. So I would say a hybrid framework is proven to have the best results.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned the manual part, because I think this is indeed something that planners already do more often than people think. Also, if a competitor, for instance, would stop a certain product, things like that, to some extent, it's also a leading indicator. Maybe in the opposite way, then they stop and they take an uplift. So I think planners indeed do that already quite more often. I see some questions in the Q&A, but we will cover those later on. Now, for doing the analysis part, so not the manual part, what kind of skills do you find important there? Is it because then it is quite technical, right? And then it's with Python, or how do you do this?
So yeah, at some level you need some coding skills. If it's now in R, Python, or SQL, you need to have the data in the right format, and then at some point you want to have a machine learning algorithm that comes into place. One could use open source software libraries, but at some point indeed you need some kind of technical skill to put this into place. Yeah.
Okay. Could you share what kind of libraries are useful, or maybe we could do that after the webinar to people as well if you.
The most especially in these contexts, the most simple model to start with is either stepwise linear regression or the lasso regression, which is then a more machine learning way. These are very effective in the selection of variables. We have also, or I did also some research on nonlinear modeling techniques, but it actually doesn't make that much of a difference how you model the information. The real value is having the right leading indicators.
Okay, interesting. I saw some hands raised from the audience. So to the audience, if you have any question, please put it in the Q&A in text format, and then we'll cover them. I see there was a question on an example of leading indicators, but that we already covered with the oil price that you did, so we'll not go into that one again. Okay, so thanks a lot, Yves. So with that, I think that's a good introduction to the first part on leading indicators, external signals. We might come back to it in the Q&A section. Now I'd like to move on more to the point of forecasting with limited historical data, which is also a very real issue that companies face. So what can companies do in this case if they have no or limited data?
Yes, so we hear a lot of artificial intelligence or machine learning methods, and a lot of these algorithms, they train on a massive amount of historical data. So they need those training data in order to estimate the parameters and make the model, so to speak. It's quite challenging, especially because well, some companies don't have that massive amount of data, either because it comes at a different data frequency. So it's the data generating process or the business process that gives us limited amount of data. Imagine you have historical sales for 5 years, but it comes in monthly buckets. Well, then you only have 60 data points. So that's rather limited, the amounts of data. Other companies, such as SMEs, they just might not keep track of historical sales data. So that's a bit challenging then to get started with artificial intelligence. I would say there is a small range from having no data to limited amount of data. So if we really have no data, perhaps if you could go to the next slide. If we really have no data and no data at all, then we're in the section of the new product forecasting, right? We launch a new product, we have no experience, and we just go for it. There, it really much is like, okay, you need the human forecast, or you need a market study. That's what there is, whatever you can get your hands on. If you start to have a bit of data, you can look for similar products. You can look like, okay, are there products that behave the same, that are the same, that behave the same, historically speaking. Then if we move to more and more data, as we obtain more and more data, we can increase our model complexity. So which means that, for example, we can look at the same data set, but on different frequencies. Then we come into those cross-sectional or cross-temporal reconciliation approaches, which means, for example, as I mentioned before, we have 5 years of data. If we look at on monthly buckets, it's only 60 data points, but we can also look at into weekly or daily buckets on daily frequency, which means we have all of a sudden from the same data set, we have a lot more data points. And we have seen that if we look at those different data sets at the same time, but at different frequencies, that it actually can increase our forecast accuracy quite a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Next to that, or the level below that, is the global modeling. which means that we now are doing the same trick, but over different products. So we look at different products and we learn from them together. So, for example, in retail, we learn from the salad as well as the yogurt for the same model at the same time. And we try to detect sub-patterns that are similar, and that way increase the estimation of those patterns over all the products together. And if that isn't enough, of course, we can go to techniques such as data augmentation, in which we add additional data, but that is then has the success rate really depends on the use case. So that's really a bit more difficult to get right.
Okay, that's a more complex one than maybe not for this session to go in full depth on. On that first one, on those market studies, is that then something typically for companies that would come from their marketing department as an input because they have access to that, they look into it already? Or how is this usually practically done?
Yeah. So in the case we really do not have any data at all, it can be a market study coming from marketing, can be from an external party, because in the end you need to come up with a number for production. So either it's a market study or it's a glass bowl you have in your desk, but in the very end you need to come up with some number to get production going.
Because this is often where companies, they get some sort of plan on, for instance, a new product also that's introduced, and then marketing has their ambitious expectations of it, or sales has their target on it, and then that is the human forecasting input. But then that needs to be adjusted, right, as the data comes in. So then it's difficult to assess or have some sort of model in place to immediately detect any bias, I assume.
Yeah, especially with new products, it's very difficult. We also see the same in fashion forecasting, where typically there is just one production batch and there is not a second production batch. So you need to get it right first time, or in this case, you definitely don't want to under forecast. You don't want to not have enough.
Indeed. And in fashion, there's also this sampling initially that they do usually before that first big batch. Yeah, indeed. Okay. And on those, on that second point, looking at similar products, still quite some companies struggle with their master data, but then this, I think, links a lot to the master data, right? Where you have defined attributes. Is that how you're gonna look at it, or do you do this in a different manner?
Yeah, so either indeed you look at the attributes that have similar properties, products that have similar properties, or you could, but again, that's getting a bit more complex, but you could look at the adoption curve, where you see our initial sales have this shape, and then we can correlate it with historical products, perhaps even in a different segment, and then see, okay, this has the same shape, could it have the same adoption curve? Yeah.
Okay, clear. And if I look at these different ways, the first two seem more easy to do, whereas the other three, the last three, they are more complex from a data science perspective and techniques that you have to undertake. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, yeah. For the last three, a lot of open source libraries are available again, but it gets more and more complicated to implement them and to implement them well, because sometimes it's easy to implement a model, but you need to optimize it and set the right parameters, of course.
Okay. Do you also have specific libraries in mind for these that are relevant?
Yeah, so for example, the temporal reconciliation, there is a library called TIEF. In R is this, and then for the global modeling we have the LightGBM, which was a winner in many of the latest forecast competitions. But there again, it's quite important to set the parameters right, because it's quite easy to implement it, but it's a bit more difficult to get it going in the right way.
Okay, clear. Thank you. So moving on to the final topic I want to cover, which is about probabilistic forecasting. So people might not be fully familiar with the concept. So again, maybe first an intro from you, Yves, without going too much into the complexity. What is probabilistic forecasting in your opinion?
Yeah, so probabilistic forecasting is instead of forecasting one number, what we would do is forecast a distribution. So which means if we have an expected value, which was our top of the distribution, and then across that distribution we'd have some what they call variance, which is the width of the distribution, which gives us a measure on how confident we are that that forecast is correct. So which means if we have a distribution that's very narrow, then we are very certain of our forecast. If we have a distribution that's quite wide, then we are not that certain of our forecast. There's a big uncertainty about it. As we see here in the graph, we can do that probabilistic forecasting for all our levels of our hierarchy. So at the bottom level, we would have the product forecasting or stock keeping unit, for example. We can do the same at business unit or product family, and then of course at the total sales. One of the problems we face inevitably is that the sum of the forecasts, for example, at the business unit, will not match the sum of the products. So there is a need to align those forecasts, and this we can do by shifting the different levels. The idea behind this, and this goes into the cross-sectional reconciliation, as we saw before. The idea behind is that the different levels learn different patterns from each other. So while on product level, we might be able to capture the weekly patterns more in detail, and on the business unit level, we might detect more the geographical elements that come into play, for example. But somehow we need to align, reconcile those different probabilistic forecasts, and that way we end up with a probabilistic forecast for each product. With that, so that probabilistic forecast gives us at the very last moment in our decision process, gives us the maximum amount of information. Based then on the different costs, so the cost of the product, the cost of lost sales, we can then optimize our decision for that product. So based on what is our customer service level that we want to obtain, we can then optimize our decision and our production quantity in the end, or inventory quantity to keep on each product individually. Yeah, that's in a very small nutshell about probabilistic forecasting.
Okay. And if you set up those kind of, because you set up that kind of range, right? Some sort of confidence intervals, as in 95% chance it falls within that, that just by basic understanding from it, let's say. How do you define that, or how do you choose what kind of confidence interval you would use?
Yeah. So indeed, you would have your expected forecast, which is the mean of your forecast distribution, and then you would have around that your 80 or 95% confidence interval, as you say. It's we call it often the forecast interval, which means that I'm 95% sure that your actual realized sales will be within those two bounds, so between the lower bound and the upper bound. Between those areas, I'm 95% sure that your actual sales will be in those limits. Again, if those limits are wide from each other, I'm not so sure about my forecast. If those two limits are quite close to each other, I'm quite certain of my future forecast. With this small forecast interval, or with this forecast interval, I can then actually optimize my decision for my customer service level. So based on the level of availability that I want to have, I can see how much items I need to put into stock. So normally you wouldn't put the expected value into stock, but you want to have a bit more, so that, for example, you can deliver 95% of your customers.
Okay. And then also, like, translating it, the risk, the kind of business that they're in, I think there might sometimes be more an inclination towards having risk of under versus over forecasting, in terms of if there's expiry dates, or if you really don't want to lose a customer, then you want to look at that range and might not go for the mean, but already go somewhere else in that range, right? That's kind of the goal of it.
Indeed. And also, and that's the most difficult part, is of course how much do you want to have. It's there the different costs come into play. So if you have a very cheap product, for example, food, more than often we overproduce because we don't want to have any lost customers, but it's very cheap to have to throw away some of the food. Of course, nowadays we want to have also or reduce that food waste. This is one of the projects we have been working on, and so we will want to optimize it in that way. But you could also think of it like, do we want to have the same 95% customer service level for all of our products? One thing you will often see, especially in bakeries, is that okay, you might not have the chocolate sandwich anymore, but you still have the chocolate croissant. Well, actually, I'm quite happy if I don't have a chocolate sandwich to take a chocolate croissant, as it's nearly the same thing. So I might in that way lower my customer service levels for each product individually, but over the group, so be sure that the customer still can select a second or a third option.
Right. Okay, clear. I think that's a good introduction for most people. People might want to go a bit deeper into it. But we have covered the 3 topics briefly already, and we are still on time. We wanted to do this in about 30 minutes, so we're good there. I see some questions coming up in the Q&A, and we have enough time for Q&A part. So if anybody still has extra questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, or you can also do it in the chat. That's not a problem. So I see here a question. Let me sort them by topic. So first, on the external signals, on the leading indicators, there's a question on the weather being a very common leading indicator. And the nuance here is that the person asks, it will always be a forecast rather than actual data. So how do you address that challenge, where the leading indicator is a forecast in itself? Is that still useful, or? That's a question, I think.
Of course, it can be done, right? You can have a weather forecast, use that. It's a common topic. It's also quite a complex topic because, for example, the number of hours of sunshine during a day might be on its own might be not so representative for example, the number of visits in your shop. Why? Because it's quite a bit, or it's different if it's sunny and it's raining, or if it's sunny and it's dry. So the weather is in itself, it's a quite complex non-linear structure, but indeed, in essence, even if we would have a composite of good and bad weather for this particular shop, even then you would need a forecast, and that forecast typically is reliable 2 weeks up. So the question is then, can I do something with 2 weeks in advance with data? Even if I need to order my materials or schedule my labor forces or resources. So it is a challenge. It works on the short term, or it can work on the short term, but it needs quite some tweaking, especially also due to the non-linear effect. Yeah.
Okay, I think that answers the question. I see a thumbs up from the person even, so that answers the question for sure. Then, thanks for the feedback. Another question, which is in the chat, which is also actually one that I had, is around the how long leading indicators are valid, or how often they should be reassessed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite right. That's actually quite relevant as well to the current daily situation. So it's quite true that you have your historical sales, you align them with a leading indicator, everything goes well, and all of a sudden the world changed, right? It was this morning in the TED that a lot of Belgian companies had a lot of export to US, but this year there is a lot more focus on export to European countries. So you might as well have a leading indicator from your market, your sector-specific market in US. Everything goes well, but then your segmentation of your clients shifts, and you have more clients of Europe for the same market. Then, of course, your leading indicator will no longer be valid, and you will need to reselect that information. There are 2 elements. Either the shift is like internal, so you know this is happening because you are steering on it. I think this is what happens now on the European market. If you know it, you can well reassess your leading indicators, give them new leading indicators that should be valid for the same sector, and do it that way. The second part is, of course, if something happens and you don't know it, the sector evolves, the market changes, but you're not aware of it. In that way, you want to have some kind of automatic selection, automatic detection of that, and that is also easy with the cheaper or with the smaller models. If a model is not that expensive to run every month or every review cycle, you just run it every review cycle, every month. And if it comes up with a different leading indicator, something has happened. And there can be a trigger activated that says, oh, something has happened. I need to review this because the model thinks the indicators are changing. If the model is too expensive to run, and that is what you would get with those very data-intensive, very complex models, then there are actually heuristics, that is a guideline, so to speak, to say like, what is the frequency that you should reassess your model? Is it every month? Is it every 3 months? Based on the cost of your compute power.
Okay. I don't get a thumbs up yet from the person asking questions, so let's see if that happens. There are some questions also from people that are asking about specific indicators for certain industries, but that's not, I think, what we necessarily wanna cover. So let me see here, another one.
Most of those indicators are in the space of macroeconomic indicators, especially for the longer lead times. It's in the framework that we've built. Actually, it's easy if you select a ton of them, like different sectors altogether. Then you run the framework, and then it makes the automatic selection. So you make, as a human, a pre-selection, so to speak, and then the model selects only the most relevant ones.
Okay.
So that way we have best of both worlds.
Okay. There is a question also on, it relates a bit to weather, and the question is more broad, and it asks, is it fair to say that leading indicators are always some kind of forecast in itself already? So people have to be aware of its accuracy, like weather, like maybe even stock market, like crude oil, Forex, consumer price index.
Are leading indicators a forecast in themselves? It's quite, yeah, you have quite a couple of ways to interpret that question, I would say. So one of the things is that indeed some of the things we measure, take for example GDP, once they are released, it is indeed some kind of forecast, because they can still be corrected after the fact. But that's a very technical one. The statistical agency can still historically correct some of the leading indicators. So in that way, yes, they try to do their best, but sometimes they make mistakes. So in that way, you could say it's a forecast. Other than that, for example, oil price, it is really realized price. So it is realized data. Same with historical stock market. It is realized data.
I think
you could always say stock market is in itself a forecast, but yeah, okay, it's a more philosophical question.
Yeah, I think that's a good, very nuanced answer, giving the different points. I think the question here is also about that red part here that you showed, and I think people are asking, or the question relates to the forecast of stock market or of that oil in the future and the impact of that already on the forecast, whereas you're saying the leading indicator is on the current data. That's the distinction.
Yeah, indeed.
Basically.
So you could use a forecast of the leading indicator. The problem is, on the forecast there will always be an error. So the error will propagate into this model, which generates, of course, a new error. So in the red zone, you will have error propagation, and that is the question then is, how do you deal with this? Does it really impact your decision or not? That is something you need to then review in detail.
Okay, clear. I see these other questions. Which ones are relevant? So the one on the probabilistic forecasting is about how do you get the BU level forecast here by aggregating individual products probability or by redoing it over the entire content of the BU itself. It's a bit more of a technical question.
Yeah. The forecast on the business unit is indeed from the historical realized production in this case, and then you make a forecast. So you extrapolate the production or the historical production. the historical production is, of course, the sum of the historical sales of the different products. So in that way, it relates. But even if you would do this, the forecast of the sum is not the same as the sum of the forecast. And that is where then your alignment comes.
Okay, clear. There's a good question, and I will put it actually more broadly here, which is about for the leading indicators for probabilistic forecasting, but also for forecasting with limited data. How much effort should go in those parts compared to the results that companies get out of them? And so is there some sort of guidance where you say, look, in these kind of industries, these situations, it is worth, you can get these kind of benefits, or is it really difficult to generalize that and it's really ad hoc that needs to be determined by people for their own case?
And effort on what exactly? On the detection or the gathering the indicators?
In the case of the external of the leading indicators of the gathering, which comes at a cost of doing the analysis, whether it's really a leading indicator and you want to automate that process, but also on forecasting with limited historical data, those three more complicated ways of doing it, right? Getting people to do this. So effort and cost versus benefits that companies can expect.
Yeah. It's a good question because indeed a lot of these, especially manual processes, they require a lot of time. We don't have time, and it's quite expensive. That's also the reason why you would have like a hybrid way. The judgmental forecasters typically have a lot of knowledge, right? Domain knowledge. They have experience. They know what's going on. It's just very difficult to quantify this in a sales figure. So we're valuable in that way. We have the experience. What we want to do is, especially this hybrid modeling, we want to gather some of that knowledge, get some groups of leading indicators, and then automate the rest of the process. You want the automation that can run on its own, that it doesn't really come at a high cost, but the human factor, you really want to limit that amount of time. Same goes with the forecasting. Ideally, you want to have a statistical forecast or a forecast that comes from machine learning models, and then validate only the problematic ones. So the ones that are trigger an alarm, you want to review those ones. The ones that have been stable and accurate for the last couple of months, you don't really want to see them because they are accurate. You don't really want to bother about those. One of the things that we now go into is also to quantify the cost of the forecast. So then that we do not stop at the forecast accuracy, but we really quantify like, okay, with this type of inventory management, this is the cost. This is the cost of lost sales, for example. This is the cost of our safety stock. And based on that, you can actually get a result in euros rather than in some statistical metric that goes forecast accuracy price. Yeah.
So if I understand you well, it's still to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. It's a lot about people's time that is an investment here mostly, rather than running the actual models usually. And then thirdly, trying to translate benefits into inventory management to see if it's worth it. That's the three step, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I will give it, let's say 30 more seconds if anybody still has any questions, because I think I've combined some questions together. So I hope everybody is okay with that. Okay. Still some questions, but they are a bit of repetition, I find. So we will not cover those questions anymore right now. But if people still do have questions, are they allowed to follow up with you directly, or do you prefer not to do that because it might be too much?
No, absolutely. As we are always looking for new cases, new studies as well. And at KU Leuven and VIVES, we have the habit of doing academic research with close collaboration with companies. So it's always very interesting to see new cases, new questions from the business, so that we can follow up that as well as just simple questions without the study. So yes, feel free. The easiest way is, I believe, on LinkedIn. That might actually be the easiest way. Yeah.
Okay, good. Because for those people asking questions about manufacturing motor companies and somebody else about case studies, think might be good for you to reach out to Yves
Yes.
directly in that case and see what is available. Okay, so Yves, I would like to thank you very much for explaining the concepts and also for answering my questions as well as those of the audience. I found it very interesting, so I believe many people also found it interesting. Thank you very much for your time.
Sure.
And to the audience, also thank you. I see some good comments also coming in the Q&A section, Yves, from people appreciating it. So thank you, everyone. You will receive the recording in case you want to still rewatch any explanation. Otherwise, you know where to find Yves on LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to present these elements. Happy to talk further afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yves. Bye, everyone.